I feel honored and also abashed to be introducing the founding executive director of Northwest China Council back in 1980 when the China Council of the Asia Society in New York spun off a dozen different regional councils. I think we're the last one standing, although there have been some new creations in Northern California and Seattle, I understand, under the old organization. So, but I think, there are lots of old timers here. Leslie Attia goes way, way back to just about the founding. Lots of people from the 1990s, current board members. I learned from the current executive director, John Wong, who has put together kind of scrapbook online. I'm trying to get a link there to our Northwest China Council website that has the history of all the impressive speakers that came in during the heyday of the founding of U.S.-China relations in the 1980s. So I think most of you folks, actually I'm about as old as most of you, but I'm a newbie here in the Portland area. I've been here for only about 11 years on a full-time basis. But all of you know Jane's erudition, charm, and modesty, I think. So I'm here to talk about the book a little bit. I have read it, all 944 pages. You probably haven't. I read some pages faster than others, I admit. But it's online, and you can download it for free. And as you know, this doesn't come totally free of charge. Usually this is paid for by your university or the author or some other organization. So thank you, Jane. This was a great gift to all of us. It is a wonderful book. This surpasses all the usual high standards of scholarship. It has actual footnotes down at the bottom of the page instead of endnotes. There is a glossary of Chinese characters for all these Chinese and Canadian Americans with their complicated multiple names as transliterated with the Chinese characters, some of which I couldn't find anywhere else, but they're in the glossary and sometimes in the footnote, like that restaurateur of Chicago, Qin Fuyin. Couldn't find him anywhere except in your book. All sorts of good stuff here. Great documentation written in clear prose for anybody to read. And I also wanted to give a plug for Sweet Bamboo, written by Jane's mother, Louise Larson, who was a journalist. Actually, here's a picture. There are great pictures in this book, too. Here's Louise Larson with Anna May Wong. This reminds us that, for one thing, Jane didn't come up through the professoriate with its perks, or what used to be the perks of the professoriate. And she also conjoins the fields of Asian studies with Asian American studies. Indeed, she provides a bridge between what we call Chinese American studies, Canadian American studies, Mexican American studies, everywhere else in the world, Chinese studies, the diaspora. It's quite amazing to have all these things joined. As to this book, Kang Youwei really looks like quite a genius, but this book tells the good, the bad, and the ugly, even about Jane's grandfather, who provided much of the material in retrospect. You could say that titularly, this book began with a 1972 Georgetown University doctoral dissertation by Robert Worden, who has done a lot of family history himself since he had a lateral ancestor who, I guess, drove the Monitor in the Monitor versus Merrimack battle of the ironclads in the Civil War. But he did not, after writing his book about this great Chinese reformer, revise it into a book. That was left for Jane. She picked up where he left off, amplified by all sorts of materials, including some found in Connecticut, where her grandfather, not only as a mentee of Kang Youwei, had managed to collect, and Jane's father also had managed to preserve all sorts of original documents. And these documents are amazing. Jane then set up sort of a universal global consortium of exchange of information, a blog where people from all over the world, which reflects what Kang Youwei did in his time. She's sort of a latter-day Kang Youwei in that respect, organizing Chinese communities. She wasn't involved in revolution, though, as far as I know. Although she is an alumna of Reed College, I understand. So the other stream besides the word and dissertation, his mentor was Hummel of the Library of Congress, and Worden then went on to have a distinguished career writing books about East Asia and other places for the Library of Congress that were distributed by the U.S. government. But meanwhile, Jane, as a 1967 alumna, had written an anthropological study of Chinese Americans featuring her family before all of the documents really had resurfaced. And so she, meanwhile, was doing this. Her mother and Jane went on a trip to the old sod, Ganzhou, I think it is in Mandarin, south of Canton. And this is the basis of this book, which I think has your hand in it too. And that was in 1977, after the death of Mao, but before the ascendancy of Deng Xiaoping. So that was quite an interesting thing. So this all led to two streams coming together to give us this wonderful 944-page book written in excellent prose. We think of Kang Youwei in three stages. He masterminded the 100 Days of Reform, or 103, or they didn't quite make it the magic Buddhist number of 108. I don't think that would have helped. He and his comrades, like the Yang Qitao, wanted to reduplicate the Meiji Restoration of 1868 in Japan, if you remember that, where some outsiders, some young samurai tried to capture the voice of the Emperor of Japan and completely transform Japan from a feudal society into a modernizing and indeed militarized society. They didn't succeed. There was a coup d'etat by the old Buddha, the Empress Dowager. A lot of people were martyred. Fortunately, Kang and Liang made it overseas, and so that's where we have the Chinese reformer and exile years, which are the strength of this book. This book tells about all their plots, all their fundraising, their organization, not only of human talent, but also of money, even a streetcar enterprise in Torreon, Mexico. That was amazing. A restaurant that Jane's grandfather personally tried to organize. He did organize it. It became one of the most famous Chinese upscale restaurants in the world. That's why when sort of not only a namesake, but an offspring of it opened here in Portland, they said, our Chinese chefs are from Chicago. Usually you would say our Chinese chefs are from San Francisco, of course, right? Of course, San Francisco had an earthquake. So anyway, then it was during this period of reform that is so completely documented with all sorts of photographs and documents in this book. And then the third period, you transformed my understanding of Kang Youwei as a philosopher and thinker too, which, we all know he wrote the Da Tung Fu, a utopian manuscript, and people have said it had influenced Woodrow Wilson, and I wonder how could that be, since it was published posthumously in 1927. But actually, your book details how he was working on it during his time of exile in Canada, U.S., during the period of Chinese exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. And so he had to fight the Sun Yat-sen people. He had to fight the Qing dynasty, which actually adopted most of his policies. And then all three groups, the Sunists, the Communists, the Qing dynasty, they all had assassination plots against each of the other two. You can read about it here. As I say, this book has the good, bad, and the ugly in it. And it's a wonderful book. So take it away, Jane. Thank you.
Our book documents the exile years of Kang Youwei, Imperial China's most famous reformer. He was the mastermind behind the Guangxu Emperor's 100 Days of Reform in 1898. When the reforms were quashed by the Empress Dowager Cixi, Kang fled overseas. He arrived in Canada in 1899 and mobilized a large political movement among Chinese overseas with at least 100,000 members on 5 continents. The Chinese Empire Reform Association sought to transform China's autocratic empire into a constitutional monarchy and allow Chinese citizens to take part in national affairs. This was only possible abroad because such organizations were forbidden in China. Between 1899 and 1911, this movement roused Chinese to care about their country's political future and united them to further their goals in a constructive way. Kang's reform movement politicized Chinese citizens and inadvertently helped produce the 1911 revolution that toppled the Chinese imperial system. I became involved with the study of Kang and his exile organization in the 1980s when I was in Portland, when I oversaw the translation of the Tom Leung papers by Portland State University Professor Charles Liu. Tom Leung was my maternal grandfather. He was a student at Kang's Guangzhou School in the 1890s and immigrated to the US in 1899, becoming the first Kang disciple to settle in this country. Tom lived in Los Angeles, worked as an herbalist, and began organizing for the Chinese Empire Reform Association. He was at Kang's side during most of 1905. He saved his correspondence with Kang and many other leaders and members of the association, most of it during the organization's heyday between 1899 and 1909. Tom began to use Leung as his American surname in English because his surname was Tom, Tan, and his children became Leungs too, and so I'm Jane Leung Larson, but we're actually Toms. However, the Chinese characters for Tom Leung, Tan Leung, show his surname. Tom is his surname. Thus, I use Tom as his surname rather than Leung. Besides organizing the local chapter in Los Angeles, Tom Leung was responsible for recruiting and funding association members who wanted to study abroad. That was a big priority of his. He wrote newspaper articles for the party's papers in New York City and San Francisco. Most faithfully, he oversaw the operation of a glamorous Chicago restaurant, King Joy-Lo, promising that it would be profitable enough to support students abroad. During the translation of the Tom Leung letters, I had to educate myself about the people and historical events described in the documents. Douglas Lee, who some of you may remember, was teaching Chinese history at Lewis and Clark at the time. He told me about the 1972 dissertation by his friend, Robert Worden. They were friends. A Chinese reformer in exile, the North American phase of the travels of Kang Youwei, 1899 to 1909. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Worden was the first doctoral level scholar to thoroughly delve into the vast assortment of archival resources then available in North America to document Kang's activities. He was also one of the first historians to integrate the history of modern China with the history of Chinese in North America. In 2011, Robert and I began to update his dissertation as a book. We incorporated the many primary sources that had come to light since 1972, including the Tom Leung papers, which had been donated to the UCLA Asian Library by my mother. We collaborated with 4 scholars whose special areas of knowledge lent much authority to our coverage of Kang and the Baohanghui in North America. And here we are speaking last year at the Museum of Chinese in America in New York. So, from the left, University of Victoria historian Zhongping Chen is the foremost expert on Chinese reformers and revolutionaries in Canada. Evelyn Huda Hart, Brown University, is a renowned historian of the Chinese in Latin America. Chen Xuezhang of Guangzhou, on the far right, the young man, contributed his deep knowledge of the lives of Kang and his students, and Yang Zheng is a PhD student in Chinese history at the University of Connecticut under the leading American historian of Kang Youwei, Peter Zero. So here's Kang. Kang was born in 1858 in the Guangdong Pearl River County of Nanhai to a long line of scholars and military men. An iconoclast, to say the least, Kang wrote China's first utopia, reimagined Confucianism as a reform philosophy, and was an avid world traveler seeking knowledge useful to China, a famous calligrapher and art collector. Our book focuses on Kang as an organizer, forming ever more ambitious groups to seek social and political reform in China. As early as 1883, Kang formed the first Chinese anti-foot binding association, which became a national movement. In 1891, Kang founded a school in Guangzhou that cultivated a cadre of devoted disciples who would lead his reform movement worldwide. China at the time of Kang Youwei was ruled by the Manchus, a minority group who came from China's northeastern provinces. The Manchus defeated the majority Han rulers of the Ming dynasty in 1644 and established the Qing dynasty, which ruled until the Chinese Empire met its end with the 1911 Republican Revolution. The Qing rulers expanded China's empire to its furthest reaches in history, and until the middle of the 19th century, China was virtually unchallenged by foreign powers. By 1895, however, China was besieged from within and without. After internal rebellions and disastrous losses to foreign powers in the Opium Wars, Sino-Japanese War, and a Russian occupation of Manchuria. The failure of China's antiquated military to defend its sovereignty and the enormous indemnities levied by the foreign victors were bad enough, but worse was the humiliation of a once dominant civilization that seemed to be on the brink of perishing. The Guangxu Emperor began his reign as a 4-year-old, supervised by his aunt on the right, the Empress Dowager Cixi, who held power as his regent. At age 18, Guangxu assumed the throne and took increasingly bold steps to reform and modernize China. He even learned English and sought knowledge far outside the classical education that his tutors could provide. Kang Youwei's books and memorials proposing reforms began to reach the emperor in 1895, and in the summer of 1898, Guangxu launched what came to be known as the 100 Days of Reform, a radical program that was largely designed by Kang and his disciples. Over 103 days, the emperor announced more than 200 edicts to modernize China's education, military, commerce, finances, agriculture, industry, mining and railways, postal system, press, technology, social customs, and political system. In September 1898, the Empress Dowager and her conservative court officials ousted the emperor, put him under house arrest on an island in the Forbidden City, and began to hunt for Kang and his followers. Kang escaped into exile, first to Hong Kong and then to Japan, and began to plot with his followers how they could return the emperor to power and resume the reform program. With the Empress Dowager again in power and the end of the 100 Days reforms on September 21st, 1898, Kang was deemed a traitor and became China's most wanted man. With a large reward for his head, Kang was trailed by assassins, leading him to sail the Pacific in April 1899 and land in Victoria, Canada. Kang's exile would last until December 1913, when he finally returned to China to bury his mother, who had died in Hong Kong earlier that year. Kang logged approximately 180,000 miles, and we've counted them, during his 15-year exile. His travels included all the European countries except Russia, where he was persona non grata, Morocco, Egypt, Turkey and Palestine, India, Sikkim and Ceylon, Burma, Malaya, Thailand, Straits Settlements, and the Netherlands Indies, Japan, and Hong Kong. And he spent approximately 29 intermittent months between 1899 and 1907 visiting the North American countries of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Kang gave his first interview to a Canadian reporter who boarded the ship after it landed in Victoria. Of course, he was already known abroad because there were lots of reports about the 100 Days of Reform and basically his deposing. The reporter wrote, "When the steamer that brought him to America reached quarantine at William Head yesterday, he was on deck and everywhere asking questions, chiefly concerning the quarantine laws and system. Then when the liner moved in from quarantine to the city, his interminable questioning was resumed. What was Victoria's population, its manner of municipal government, its facilities for policing and protecting against fires, its school and hospital arrangements?" And notably, in Kang's first few days in Canada, he visited the British Columbia Parliament, met the mayor of Victoria, and inspected warships docked at a nearby naval base. But most significantly, he became immersed in the lives and customs of the local Chinese. Leading Chinese welcomed Kang on the night of his arrival, beginning a close relationship with men in Victoria and Vancouver, BC, who would adopt Kang's reform program as their own. They also succeeded in convincing Kang to advance their causes, particularly the discrimination and immigration restrictions they faced as overseas Chinese. Kang's speeches in Chinese were met with enthusiasm, especially when he mentioned the idea of a large overseas Chinese commercial corporation to invest in China's industrial development. Although Kang sought to enter the United States in 1899, where he hoped to meet President McKinley and actually seek U.S. military help to return the emperor to power, his entrance was blocked by Chinese exclusion laws and the government's reluctance to risk a dangerous diplomatic and military confrontation with China by supporting Kang. Only 5 years later did Kang succeed in gaining admission to the U.S. On July 20th, 1899, in Victoria, BC, Kang joined with his Chinese compatriots to found the Baohuanghui, or Protect the Emperor Society, which is the Chinese name of the Chinese Empire Reform Association. And that was the Chinese Empire Reform Association is an official name of theirs. This is the founding headquarters building in Victoria. The parapet reads, "The First Chinese Empire Reform Association," and displays the crossed Baohuanghui and Qing flags. The building was built in 1905 and restored inside and outside and out in the 2000s. In 1899, Kang collaborated with a small group of overseas Chinese leaders to organize the Baohuanghui and spur its growth. Kang and these leaders drafted an organizational charter mandating chapters to be formed throughout the world, newspapers to be published for propaganda and education, and banks and other businesses to be established to counter foreign control of China. The organization would be led by a president and vice president who would be Kang Youwei and his most prominent disciple, Liang Qichao. The headquarters in Asia would receive and distribute donations. Most important were the local chapters, and they were supposed to hold weekly meetings with speeches, newspaper reading, and group singing, which is something I think he learned from Christian churches or something. He was very impressed by the organizational things that he saw in the West. Chapters were encouraged to exchange picture posters, group letters, and telegrams. By the end of 1899, there were chapters in the US, Canada, Southeast Asia, Australia, and Japan. The organization would expand to Africa, Europe, and Latin America. In September, Kang summoned his contacts in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco to Vancouver to plan the expansion of the Baohuanghui in the US. These men became the backbone of this embryonic organization. The two Portland leaders whom Kang called to Canada were Liang Hongxuan on the left and Li Meijin on the right. Liang Hongxuan, a businessman, wrote Tom Liang, my grandfather, in 1901. He described the mixed reaction of Portland Chinese in 1899. "I organized a meeting and showed Kang's letter to people at the Benevolent Association. At the time, there were people who attacked my initiative. I simply went ahead and established a chapter. However, by 1901, when this letter was written, he wrote that out of over 2,000 Chinese in Portland, 700 or 800 of them were members, which is a pretty good percentage, I'd say, and also reported that over $8,000 in donations had been sent to association headquarters. And Li Meijin, who is sometimes, his name is, you can see the alternate spellings there in Cantonese romanization, was a prominent businessman, labor contractor, hop farmer, and owner of Quang Lun Tai, a dry goods store at 61 2nd Street, the same address as the Bao Huanghui office. He was a founder of the CCBA, with his photo, this photo found on a poster of CCBA donors. I think it must be much later than 1899, though. He was a founder, he was called the mayor of Chinatown. He was a staunch Bao Huanghui supporter and formed a strong relationship with Kang that continued even throughout the organization's most difficult periods, and I'll touch on him throughout the presentation. To date, we have identified 232 association chapters on 5 continents. North America hosted 160 chapters. I don't know if you, let's see, I guess it all shows there. And the in US, Canada, and Mexico. North American chapters sponsored schools, newspapers, military academies, women's associations, businesses, and a mutual aid association. The chapters helped fund and organize political pressure campaigns like boycotts and petitions that aimed to influence both the Qing and foreign governments. The Bao Huanghui in mainland US had 11 divisions, and we have identified 86 chapters in the US. Montana and California both had divisions to themselves. The Pacific Northwest Division had the most chapters and encompassed Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. We've identified 23 chapters listed here, but there were surely more, as in 1903, Liang Qichao wrote that this division had 26 chapters. But we're still guessing the geographic location for more than 50 chapters whose names in Chinese appear in primary sources. And, trying to guess, from a Chinese name, which is generally a transliteration of a Cantonese, in Cantonese, of what it might be is difficult. Portland was a highly significant chapter and headquarters for the Pacific Northwest Division. Kang visited the city twice, once upon his arrival in the U.S. in February 1905, and again that fall, making a trip from the East Coast. This is the entry for Portland from our table of Bao Huanghui chapters, mapping the Bao Huanghui. It's updated online on the Bao Huanghui Scholarship blog, and it's also in the book. Although the chapter did not host a newspaper or other business, it had a women's association branch, a Western Military Academy school, and a mutual aid association. Kang not only relied on Bao Huanghui leaders who lived in North America, but also sent several deputies who were especially close to him as peripatetic organizers. Their prestige as Kang's students gave them unusual influence to establish chapters and help work out internal organizational problems, explore business opportunities, and raise funds. Liang Qitian, on the left here, was the first such Kang deputy to come to the Americas, arriving in Canada in March 1900. He was reported to be in Portland in July and San Francisco in August before traveling widely in the U.S. Liang Hongxuan, in his letter to Tom Liang in April 1901, wrote that wherever Liang traveled in Oregon, the organization did well. Liang founded the Baker City chapter, and Liang Hongxuan wrote, "The people are very enthusiastic for the cause. I really admire and respect their patriotism. If every place were like that, I am sure China would be strong someday." So Liang Jiu, the man on the right, sent this photo to Tom Liang, and Liang Qitian did so. We found this photo album of Tom Liang's contacts in the Baohuanghui, early contacts just very recently. We visited the Victoria Founding Headquarters building. The owner, Ian Sutherland, the man standing at the left, showed us the contents of a battered tin box discovered in a structural post during renovation. It was a time capsule with items the founding Victoria members found significant. There were foreign postage stamps, a Baohuanghui membership badge, which you can see on the bottom left, July 1905 issues of Baohuanghui newspapers such as the Chinese World from San Francisco, pictured here, and a colored sketch on an envelope of the coat of arms for the parapet of the Victoria building. Sutherland used this sketch to restore the parapet to its original appearance, as shown in the drawing on the right. These artifacts show how the Baohuanghui network penetrated Chinese communities in North America, quite consciously, with the intention of preparing members to create and lead a modern nation. Baohuanghui leaders fashioned an organizational identity that echoed a national identity, including a charter or constitution, a flag, badges, rules for meetings and elections. From the group, it was hoped, would come the nation. This is an early picture poster from the Butte, Montana chapter, soon after its formation by Liang Qitian in 1901. So it's a very early poster. The Guangxu Emperor is pictured at the top with the chapter officers and board members below. The Anaconda Standard in August 1905 reported, "The walls of the association rooms in Butte are covered with photographic groups of different local bodies belonging to the Reform Guard, there being about 50 in all." And there they are at a meeting. While no picture poster for Portland has been found, we have two valuable items documenting the members of the chapter in Portland and the Women's Association branch in 1903. Li Meijin is the chapter president, and the one on the left is the chapter, the Portland chapter. And he's listed at the top of the left-hand roster. The right-hand roster is for the Women's Association branch. Here, the founder of the Women's Association, Kang is listed as association president at the top, and the Portland president is Huang Duanlian. Liang Qiqiao, both in his own time and even more so today, arguably was better known among Chinese than his teacher, Kang Youwei. So he's standing by Kang in the picture on the left. His eloquent political commentary appeared in Reform newspapers and journals and was widely read. Kang probed deeply into how groups, and especially political associations, were essential to cultivating citizenship and a sense of common nationality. And in his role as vice president of the association, he was the most important Baohuanghui organizer in its early years. By the time he arrived in British Columbia on March 3, 1903, Liang had traveled on behalf of the Baohuanghui in Japan, Hawaii, Hong Kong, Singapore, Ceylon, Australia, and the Philippine Islands. He founded new chapters, established or bolstered newspapers and schools, founded publishing and translation companies, raised funds, and promoted commercial corporation shares. Liang toured Canada and the U.S. for 9 months. Crossing Canada, Liang went to New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C., and then toured the western and northwestern states, ending his journey in California in October. In the Northwest, Liang first visited Pocatello and Boise, Idaho, followed by Pendleton, Oregon, where he established an association chapter. He then went to Walla Walla, Washington, and from there to Seattle, where he and his entourage were joined by Kang's daughter, Kang Tongbi, who had crossed the border from Canada, sent by her father to North America as his personal representative and to get a Western higher education. Kang Tongbi lived in the United States from 1903 to 1909. She was the first Asian student at Barnard College in New York City. She formed a Baohuanghui Women's Association upon her arrival in Canada. This was probably the first Chinese political association expressly for women. It had 12 chapters in the US and Canada, including Portland, Seattle, and Astoria in the Northwest. This elegant Chinese Empire Reform Association poster features images of the Qing and Baohuanghui flags, Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao, Kang Tongbi, and the Guangxu Emperor, as well as all the board members of the Victoria chapter. The poster reads, "In the rise of the country or its fall, men and women share equal responsibility." Chinese and foreign women warriors, including Joan of Arc, are celebrated in poetic couplets on the side. Tongbi's feminist message reflected her father's belief in the equality of men and women and won over enthusiastic followers, including many of the wives of Baohuanghui leaders such as Tom Liang. Tongbi was also at the center of many of her father's organizing activities in the U.S., and as a result, she received letters from Kang and Baohuanghui leaders, both men and women. Several hundred letters, photos, and other items of interest were left behind by Tongbi at the Star Tudor home where she lived in South Windsor, Connecticut. The collection was discovered by our research team in 2013. Here today in the audience is Qirong Zhang of Vancouver, BC, who transcribed and organized the documents. He came all the way for this talk and is now publishing the collection as a book. This photo belonged to Kang Tongbi and was taken in Portland, Oregon in September 1903. Liang Qichao, who's on the bottom left, is next to his younger brother, Liang Qi-sun, who is studying in Chicago. The two standing men, just identified by Qirong, are Moi Ba-wing and Liu Giati-ke, or Liu Ji-chi, of Portland and Seattle. Tongbi spent about 3 weeks traveling with the Liang brothers, and then Liang Qi-sun escorted her east to Connecticut, where she would study for the next 4 years. Upon arriving in Portland, the party was feted at a banquet in Chinatown, attended by about 60 Portland Chinese, no doubt including the chapter president, Li Meijin. While American newspapers report a mostly positive response to the association, there was opposition. An article in the Oregon Journal headlined, "Chinese Leader Ridicules Reform," quotes an unnamed merchant who felt it was useless to recruit people outside of China to influence what was going on inside the country, and claimed that the association members were being bilked of their hard-earned money to pay for luxuries for its leaders. Liang's group took a side trip to Astoria. The local paper, The Astorian, reported there were about 300 Chinese living in the city, and that the Reform Association received donations totaling $15,000, with 3 donors who gave $1,000 each and others who gave $100 or more. Although the Astorian wrote that there were only 10 Chinese women in Victoria, Kang Tongbi formed a women's association. Its new members then donated $600 to a favorite project of Liang Qichao, the Guangdong Public School, on the condition that the school admit girls as well as boys. The school opened in 1905 in Guangzhou to educate the children of Baohuanghui members, left back in China, of course. Its classes in English, gymnastics, and music were rarely offered in Chinese schools at the time. Traveling from Europe, Kang made his 3rd trip to Canada in November 1904. He landed in Montreal and proceeded to Vancouver, BC. Thousands attended a talk he gave at City Hall. Attending Kang's welcoming dinner was U.S. Consul L. Edwin Dudley, who in 1899 had failed to convince officials in Washington to allow Kang to enter the United States. Dudley toasted Kang, stating that President Theodore Roosevelt was, in quotes, a friend of the Reform Association and always stood for the integrity of the Chinese Empire. With this change in official American attitude to Kang, Consul Dudley could give Kang a critical Section 6 certificate, allowing him to enter into the U.S. on the basis of residency in Canada. Dudley also wrote letters of introduction to U.S. Secretary of State John Hay and others that stated, His Excellency is a tourist within the meaning of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Tourists were admitted, and therefore entitled to enter the United States. But he is more than this. He is at the head of a great movement for the uplifting of his people, and I shall feel personally obliged for any courtesy you may show His Excellency and the gentlemen who accompany him. But Kang had to delay his trip to the U.S. because of a bad case of bronchitis, and it was not until mid-February 1905 that he left Canada. Kang and his traveling party arrived in the United States on February 11, 1905. They crossed into the U.S. on the Central Pacific Railway at Sumas, Washington, and proceeded to Port Townsend, where the Kang's visa was certified by immigration officials. The party gave their destination as Seattle, Portland, and Washington, D.C., but by the end of Kang's 1905 trip, he had visited more than 50 American cities and towns. Kang's spokesman, Zhou Guoxian, told the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, in quotes, "We have come to the United States because it is a country where the greatest effort toward progressive China should be made, a country of freedom and broad-minded ideas. It is only fitting that Chinese in America should do much towards making the movement a success." And indeed, it was in the U.S., with its 100,000 Chinese residents, 100,000 Chinese residents, and relative freedom of action, that the Baohuanghui achieved its fullest potential. After 2 days in Seattle, Kang's party left for Portland, where he was met at the train station on February 13th by about 100 Portland Chinese. Kang addressed several hundred of his compatriots at United Methodist Church, and in Salem, he had his first taste of American institutions. He visited Governor George Chamberlain and then inspected the state penitentiary and mental asylum. At the penitentiary, Wang Ji, an aged Chinese prisoner who had been convicted of murder in 1898, fell to Kang's feet and begged forgiveness for his crime. Kang asked the governor to pardon the man, and the next day Wang Ji was freed and taken to Portland, where Baohuanghui members were to send him to China. Keeping a notebook at hand to record his observations, Kang toured every corner of the penitentiary, from the scaffold and the trapdoor in the execution room to the chapel. At the asylum, besides animated discussion with a doctor about Chinese and American theories of insanity, he took special interest in the laundry room machinery, in quotes, lovingly examining the washing machines and wringers in actions. I think he crawled all over them and looking at them. The next day, Kang visited Willamette University and spoke to several hundred students through his interpreter. Kang then spent about 10 days at Li Meijin's hop farm on the Willamette River, about 25 miles south of Portland, in Butteville, I guess is how it's pronounced, and in hopes of recovering from his bronchitis. He wrote Tung Bi that it afforded him isolation from socializing and making speeches, but complained that it was hard living with no comfortable mattress. So this is a public or group letter written by Kang and printed by the Portland chapter for distribution to members throughout the world. Kang is announcing new organizational initiatives to increase the benefits members receive from joining the Baohuanghui, while also requiring them to actively support the group by openly displaying their identities as members and by making financial contributions. Kang credits Li Meijin and the Portland chapter with starting the first mutual aid arm of the Baohuanghui called Lianwei Bu, or Mutual Defense Division, to give members monetary support in a personal emergency, such as when they were ill or had to return to China. Kang also proposed cleanliness bureaus to establish bathhouses and barbershops in Chinatowns because he had been bluntly told by Canadian officials that the Chinese were looked down upon, in part because of their filthy housing, dirty clothing, and unwashed bodies. As a result, Kang ordered the Northwest chapters, led by Portland's in quotes, loyal and righteous Li Meijin to take the lead in organizing mutual defense divisions and cleanliness bureaus. And he also announced that all members henceforth were to wear the newly designed membership badge and that the membership fees would be standardized at $5. Chapters were to prepare lists of new members for publication in Bahongwei newspapers to reinforce the importance of membership. So from Portland, Kang traveled to Astoria on March 2nd, addressing his countrymen at the local opera house before proceeding to California. On his way south, Kang spoke to Chinese in Sacramento, Fresno, and Bakersfield. He arrived in Los Angeles on March 15, 1905. His former student, Tom Leung, hosted Kang and his party, who lived for 2 months in a house across from Westlake Park, now MacArthur Park. Kang is pictured here with 2 members of the Los Angeles chapter, George Lim and Tom Leung, standing on the left. On the right is Zhou Guoxian, Kang's secretary and interpreter in Europe and the United States from 1904 to 1907. In the center is Ben-O Young of the Fresno chapter, who, like Tom Leung and Zhou Guoxian, would remain at Kang's side for much of his lengthy U.S. tour. Young was an instructor for the Fresno Western Military Academy, which is their military school, and may have acted as Kang's bodyguard. In Fresno, hundreds of local Chinese had attended Kang's speech at the China Alley Theater. He called for the men to cut their queues and introduced his philosophy of gender equality. In the audience was a dedicated Bahongwei member, Ha Gum, who brought his 15-year-old daughter, Lily Ha. Stories have been told that Lily was so taken by Kang that she offered to play the Chinese zither for him after the talk, a meeting that led to a mutual infatuation fired by letters over the next 2 years. We don't have any of those letters, so we don't know. Ben-O Young and his wife were the matchmakers for their 1907 marriage, when Kang took Lily as his 3rd wife, and he had 6 wives in all at the end, in New York City. Lily could speak and write English and Chinese and became Kang's favored wife and traveling companion. During Kang's sojourn in Los Angeles, he focused on the Western Military Academy, the development of the commercial corporation network of Bahongwei businesses, and took his first steps to oppose the Chinese exclusion policy, resulting in a massive boycott of American goods. The Western Military Academy was founded in 1904 in Los Angeles. In its prime, in 1905, there were branches in more than 30 American cities, including the Northwest cities of Bellingham, Portland, Seattle, Spokane, Tacoma, and Walla Walla. Young Chinese men were eager to enter the academy, even though they had to buy their own uniforms and weapons, pay tuition, and devote many hours a week to drills and classes. Physical training for a patriotic cause, learning how to handle modern weapons, being part of a close-knit team, and working with the American military instructors had great appeal for the cadets. Most important for the reform cause, the academy instilled Chinese nationalism and pride, not only among the cadets, but in their local towns and communities. Kang saw the academy as training soldiers who would eventually be able to defend China against foreign enemies. The Chinese name was Gancheng Xuexiao, or Shield and Rampart School, with the shields and city ramparts referring to the defenders of the nation. The originator of the Western Military Academy and its chief instructor was Homer Lee. Although physically unfit for military duty, he'd been crippled since childhood. Lee was an amateur student of warfare and yearned to see his theories of military science activated. He believed he could successfully lead Chinese soldiers into battle. His military knowledge not only impressed Kang in 1905, but also Sun Yat-sen, who took Lee back to China in 1911 as his military advisor. Lee recruited National Guard members and veterans of the Spanish-American War as academy instructors, and designed a rigorous curriculum, but it was Baohonghui members who organized the branch academies. The academy was strongly supported by the association chapters and likely would have continued had not Li's overweening ambitions created a serious problem. When speaking to the American instructors in the American press, Li called the school the Chinese Reform Army. The U.S. government and governors of California and New York were suspicious that the Baohonghui was violating international neutrality laws by training troops on American soil with the intention of overthrowing the Chinese government. As a result, in 1906, Kang had to dismiss Li and disband the Western Military Academy. The Baohonghui Commercial Corporation, or Shangwu Gongsi, was envisioned by Kang as a Chinese East Asia company. It was a worldwide business network encompassing banks, newspapers and publishing companies, restaurants and hotels, agricultural, commodity and natural resources companies, and railroad, streetcar, and steamship companies. Some projects never saw the light of day, although they got a lot of investments, such as a steamship concession between Mexico and China, while many others survived only a few years, and a few long outlasted the political association that their profits were meant to support, most notably the newspapers in San Francisco and Honolulu that published until 1969 and 1978. In 1905, during his U.S. tour, Kang promoted the sale of commercial corporation shares to members and helped found two businesses, a bank in New York City and the restaurant in Chicago. He then went to Mexico and threw himself into ever more ambitious business projects, including the steamship concession, real estate investments, a streetcar line in Torreon, and a bank. These projects put a great burden on the entire commercial corporation, especially after the 1907 worldwide financial crisis. On May 10, 1905, the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce proposed a national boycott of American goods to protest the U.S. government's harshly applied policies prohibiting Chinese immigration. Millions of Chinese at home and abroad were stirred by the boycott, which they learned about in newspapers, novels, speeches, and songs. Boycott rallies across China attracted thousands. Merchants stopped buying and selling American products, and Chinese overseas sent thousands of dollars in donations to support the cause. Few knew that a telegram sent by Kang Youwei from Los Angeles around May 1st had set in motion a chain reaction connecting Kang, Baohonghui activists around the world, and the Shanghai General Chamber of Commerce. Spring 1905 was a tense time for the Chinese in the United States. Pressure was building on China to renew an expired 1904 treaty that would require China to agree to the prohibition of laborers entering the U.S. In Los Angeles, Kang sent an urgent group telegram to Liang Qichao in Yokohama, the editors of the influential Baohonghui newspaper in Shanghai, and other groups of Baohonghui activists in Hong Kong and elsewhere. Kang explained that a new American envoy was on his way to Beijing to pressure the Qing Foreign Ministry to sign the treaty. China would fall into great disorder if laborers were completely cut off from the U.S., where they had been earning money to send back home. He urged action, and this is what he wrote. "This is a matter of life or death. I hope you can organize a rally and urge everyone to send telegrams to our government and to provincial governors appealing for help. At the same time, we should use newspapers to arouse popular sentiment. We may succeed in remedying the situation." Liang Qichao recalled that a Baohonghui leader in 1903 had proposed boycotting American products as the most effective way to influence American exclusion policy. Thus, it was no coincidence that the editors of the Shanghai Shibao newspaper met with leaders of the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce, which on May 10th announced the boycott. Shibao became the mouthpiece of the boycott, and its office a gathering place for boycott strategizing. This was China's first mass movement, which was followed by a 1908 anti-Japanese boycott and a multi-year petition movement to convene a national assembly and draft a constitution in China. American officials monitoring the boycott movement as it unfolded in the United States and China soon suspected the hand of the Bahonghui in galvanizing the boycott. This opened the door for President Roosevelt to meet twice with Kang in 1905, in June 1905, specifically to talk about how to improve the treatment of Chinese immigrants in order to stop the boycott. On June 16th, Kang Youwei met with President Roosevelt and Acting Secretary of State Francis B. Loomis at the White House. According to this newspaper report, written by Tom Leung, who was at the meeting, Kang proposed that Chinese exclusion laws should be abolished. In response, Tom reported, the U.S. President said, "I cannot bear to see the U.S. law so harshly limiting the Chinese," and said that he would try his best to remedy this situation. Roosevelt had already begun to plan executive action to ameliorate the treatment of Chinese immigrants. And when he met again with Kang on June 24th, the president could tell Kang about his imminent announcement of a directive to relax Exclusion Act enforcement. No doubt Roosevelt hoped that Kang would react to this positive news by backing away from support of the boycott. Other influential Chinese community members had met with the president to discuss the boycott during this period, but only Kang commanded an organization and transnational press with influence on public opinion in China. Kang continued to promote the boycott as he traveled in the U.S. He told the Boston Herald, in this story, President Roosevelt's recent action relaxing in some measure the rigid enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act is by no means satisfactory to the Chinese people. They are rapidly becoming more and more enlightened and will insist upon being treated exactly in the same manner as the most favored nations, or the boycott which has been declared against American goods will spread and be rigidly enforced over the entire Chinese empire. By the end of July, Kang presided over a 5-day plenary meeting in New York City to debate and adopt a new Bahonghui charter. At least one representative from Portland attended. Kang remained on the East Coast until mid-September, and then with Tom Leung and his interpreter, Zhou Guoxian, headed to Portland, with stops in Chicago, St. Paul, Billings, Helena, Livingston, Butte, Spokane, Walla Walla, and Pendleton, arriving in Portland on October 5th. Kang had badly wanted to attend the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, but failed to gain admission to the U.S. in time. Portland was hosting its own World's Fair in 1905, the Lewis and Clark Exposition, and this was probably the main reason he returned to the city. China did not have an official presence at the Portland Fair, unlike at St. Louis, where Prince Pulun, the Qing prince, led the large Chinese delegation. Instead, the Chinese exhibitors in Portland were mostly merchants. While these merchants, who came from China, were subject to the Chinese Exclusion Act, their entry and movements in the U.S. were not restricted by the aggressively enforced 61 special rules imposed on Chinese participants in the St. Louis Fair. The treatment of the St. Louis Chinese exhibitors was one reason for the anti-American boycott, which was underway when Kang returned to Portland. Kang told the Oregonian that he would not discuss questions now disturbing the relations between China and the United States. In other words, the boycott. Kang believed that the Bahonghui should help pay the costs of sending students to the United States, England, Germany, France, and Japan for education and subjects useful to China's modernization. Tom Leung convinced Kang that these students could be supported with profits from a successful Chinese restaurant. Before they parted in Portland, Kang handed Tom nearly $7,300 in Bahonghui funds to establish such a restaurant, the first transaction in a long and costly project. From the beginning, Funds that Kang saw as loans to be paid back, Tom understood as investments. The disputes that arose would estrange Kang from Tom and contribute to the rapid decline of the Baohonghui in 1909. And only a month after Kang gave Tom funds in Portland, he ordered Tom to lend as much as $7,000 from the restaurant funds to Portland leader Li Meijin. Li had requested Kang loan him $7,000 because of a business loss, and Kang wanted to comply because, as he wrote Tom Leung, he is a righteous person. How can we not help him? In the end, Tom did lend Li $5,000 out of that $7,300, but only $4,000 was repaid by Li. Tom Leung was responsible for selling shares, procuring loans, and distributing funds to students to support the students, while Baohonghui members who owned successful restaurants in Chicago ran Kingjoy, and really the fanciest restaurants in the U.S. at the time were in Chicago. On the left is the full-page inaugural ad in the Chicago Tribune for the opening of Kingjoy. It's not very readable there. In December 1906, Kingjoy far outshone other Chinese restaurants in Chicago in glamour and popularity. However, it did not have many profits to share with either students or shareholders, like most restaurants, and only 18 students were given a total of about $7,500 from Kingjoy in its early years. Moreover, as Kang was beset with increasing demands from the Mexican businesses, he attempted to extricate cash from the newly opened restaurant. This greatly complicated Tom's financial management. Kang began referring to Tom Leung as Thief Tom and accused him of embezzlement. Their last known communication was in August 1908, and Tom Leung dropped out of the Baohonghui and Kingjoy management. Before he exited the scene, he published a compilation of his correspondence with Kang, and actual, not photocopies, but actual mimeographed copies of the actual, handwritten letters, to expose what he thought was Kang's duplicity, which did much to create doubts among Baohonghui members. Kingjoy, however, survived for 20 years. It was managed directly by the Baohonghui under the Commercial Corporation until 1912, when it was sold to a consortium of Baohonghui leaders, who finally closed the restaurant in 1926. And Kingjoy was emulated by or directly spawned dozens of similar restaurants in other cities, including Portland's Kingjoy Cafe on the right, which bragged in its November 1913 opening day ad, "The manager and our chefs are recently from Chicago." One result of the reformers' political activism was the near universal acceptance that China needed to replace its autocracy with a Western-influenced form of constitutional government. In September 1906, the Qing court announced a period of transition to a constitutional monarchy, which was welcomed by Kang. Thus, in March 1907, the Baohonghui, or Protect the Emperor Society, changed its name to the Imperial Constitutional Association, or Diguo Xianzhenghui. It was thought the emperor no longer needed protecting. Kang presided over a plenary session in New York City with Li Meijin representing Portland. He's not in this photo of the members, neither is Tom Leung, who also attended. They adopted a new charter. Article 4 lays out what could be the principles of a national constitution. It reads in part, "The people are the basis of the nation." Constitutionalism entails popular rights and public discussion. We must strive to expand our citizens' rights by forming a parliament so we can participate in governing our country. Soon, more than 200 Xianzhenghui, still called Chinese Empire Reform Association, chapters signed a radical constitutional petition written by Kang that galvanized constitutionalists inside China and outraged the Qing court because of its sweeping demands. A massive constitutional petition movement grew between 1909 and 1911, and the Qing government began its slow transition into a constitutional system. The legislators, many of whom were constitutional reformers, energetically practiced legislating in the sessions of the advisory provincial assemblies and the advisory national assembly. These government-sanctioned but rather powerless bodies further accelerated popular demand for full political participation. Ironically, at the same time, Kang's overseas organization became submerged in a morass of dissolution and dissension, born of plunging too deeply into risky business ventures. Kang's combustible personality and tempestuous relationships with underlings exacerbated the problems. Thus, while the political influence of Kang and his Chinese Empire Reform Association reached a pinnacle inside China, the organization was reeling abroad under the commercial corporation collapses, the suspicious death of the Guangxu Emperor in November 1908, and the rise of revolutionary challengers. How could it be that a few selfish traders could bring us to ruin after 10 years of doing business, with our power of several hundred chapters and the sweat and blood of more than 1 million comrades? In May 1909, Kang wrote Li Meijin from Europe in great distress. A group of Kang's closest followers had challenged the supremacy of the association and its commercial corporation by targeting members to buy shares in a rival company. Vancouver Ba Huanghui founder Ye En, whom Kang had sent to Hong Kong to manage the commercial corporation, led a delegation to the U.S. and Canada to sell shares in the Zhenhua Mining Company to Xianzhonghui members, while attacking the corruption and management of the commercial corporation. Kang and Liang Qichao failed to strong-arm the Zhenhua leaders into ceding control to this commercial corporation. The dispute created hostility and disillusionment among Xianzhonghui members. Kang's letter to Li detailed his side of the scandal, because you are the most ardent party activist, and you're truly a big shareholder in the commercial corporation. Kang blamed those he called traitors, like Ye En and Tom Leong, for the decline in prestige and power of his Reform Association. In truth, it was he who most often thrust the association into new business ventures to the detriment of political goals. His revolutionary rivals, meanwhile, took advantage of the reformers' chaos. By 1911, inside China, the constitutionalists lost hope they could achieve their goals under Qing rule, as the Qing court delayed and obstructed the resolutions passed by the government-sanctioned assemblies. All that it took to topple the Qing dynasty was an accidental uprising in Wuchang on October 10, 1911, and the Qing lost its mandate to govern. On January 1, 1912, Sun Yat-sen was inaugurated as provisional president of the Republic of China. After the October 10th Wuchang uprising, Chinatowns throughout North America began to celebrate what looked like a promising future, political future. Revolutionary activists pulled down Qing dragon banners to raise their Republican flag. In Portland, Li Meijin, still leading the Chinese Empire Reform Association, was, in the words of the Oregonian, severely beaten in the effort to protect the property of the association. Members of the revolutionary group Young China entered the building and attempted to tear down portraits of the emperor and other symbols of the imperial state, including the outdated sign for the Ba Huanghui with its inflammatory reference to the emperor, which had not been replaced when the organization changed its name in 1907. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association held a meeting to mediate the dispute between Young China and Li, who was hooted by the 200 present when he stated, and he apparently spoke very good English, that the Constitutional Association was as much designed to protect the President of the Republic, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, as the Emperor. While Li promised to remove the offending Ba Huanghui sign, he stalled, declaring that he would not be coerced by anybody, not even by the idiotic, autocratic secretary of the Young China Association. So he was as outspoken as Kang, I guess. A similar drama was playing out in Huntington, Oregon, a railroad town on the Snake River, whose Reform Association chapter had existed for more than a decade. The members were first told to display the new Republican flag and adopt the solar calendar instead of the lunar calendar, the Chinese calendar. After complying, the revolutionaries said that their association sign had 2 improper characters, Diguo, imperial. They removed the sign, but partisans of Sun Yat-sen vandalized the association office, removed the inscribed tablets at the entrance, and tossed everything in the street, chasing those in the office out of the building where they were beaten. This pre-printed numbered membership certificate issued by Bahonghui headquarters in Hong Kong and filled out in 1906 for Liang Changrei of Portland, showing a payment of $5, is one of many found on Chinese auction sites and in the collections of Tom Leung and other Bahonghui members, artifacts saved for more than 100 years. The political goals of Kang and the Chinese Empire Reform Association are their true legacy for China. Constitutionalism, citizen participation, a balance of power, multi-ethnic nationalism, and representative government. That the reformers failed to meet these goals should not diminish the magnitude of their ambitions and accomplishments. China, apart from Taiwan in recent decades, has never institutionalized a competitive, constitutional, and representative political system, bolstered by independent citizen association, strong political parties, and a free press. The Bahonghui reform ideology has been called an early expression of Chinese liberalism, a middle way that joined the interests and freedoms of individuals to public and national interests. Kang and his reform movement are in a direct line to contemporary Chinese pleas for political representation and constitutional government. The 2010 Nobel Prize winner, Liu Xiaobo, who has been likened to Kang, was a moderate dissident intellectual. He died in prison in 2017 for his role as the most prominent author of Charter 08. This online manifesto called for a citizens' movement, in quotes, so that we can bring to reality the goals and ideals our people have been incessantly seeking for more than 100 years. It described the 1898 100 Days of Reform as China's first attempt at modern political change. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hi, Jane. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. So one of the things that struck me earlier in your talk, you were talking about the Bao Honghui, all the different chapters in the Northwest. Mm-hmm. And I was especially struck by the size of the towns like La Grande, Oregon, Baker City, Walla Walla, Sheridan, Wyoming, these small places. And so I'm wondering, the picture that you had of the men who joined it in Butte, they all looked like professionals, the way they were dressed. But I always, when I think of the small towns in the inland Northwest in that time, I think of, mining and railway workers and manual laborers. So did you learn anything about the livelihoods of these Bao Honghui members who were in these small regions or small towns in the Northwest, and how they got so politicized?
Well, it was a pretty diverse group. I know it. The leaders were all merchants. They weren't professionals as such. They may have been herb doctors or something, but he was actually, herbalists were considered business leaders. But but there were, mining towns, obviously, people who worked in the railroad, laundry workers, etc., restaurant workers. Those people were involved. They were, it was a movement, and they got involved. They may not have been leaders of the group. Most of the posters mainly showed the leaders, not just the members, and they had fairly extensive boards of directors. But it was quite diverse and in very small towns, some of which no longer exist in BC, I'm sure. They're ghost towns. But so it was much more diverse than one would think. The people who were involved as the leaders were, I think, almost totally, not totally. I mean, they were business people in one way or another. Some may not have been very literate, but they were involved, and they may have had other people write their letters, etc. But yes, it was a pretty diverse group, and I think because they had these meetings and rallies, and they may not have necessarily paid the $5 membership fee. I don't know, but they were inspired by the whole idea of identifying as Chinese, I guess, because the whole idea of citizenship and nation for China, because it's the Qing dynasty. It was the dynasty. It was the the Qing ruling court. It was the way the country was identified. So, Kang wanted to change the name to Zhonghua from Da Qinghua, or the big Qing Empire. So.
Thank you, Jane. We have another question back here.
Thank you, Jane. This has just been fascinating. My name's Carolyn. Very curious, this may be anecdotal, about your maternal grandfather and kind of the relationship and the falling out with Kang. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I mean, they were very close. They trusted each other. At one point, Kang said, we trusted each other to the point where, I trusted you too much. It was unfortunately all too common with Kang and his close followers that there would be these, because Kang was rather autocratic in his behavior, frankly. But it was a very long story, and one that was known quite a bit in China because of Tom Leung's publication, in which he talks about his side of the case, documents, the money going to and from, him for the support of the students and for the restaurant and so on. But it developed over time, and there were actual disagreements about what was an investment, and there were various people involved. There was this bank in New York that distributed a lot of the money, particularly in the later years. Of course, it was formed in 1906 after this bank was formed. And so there were various people involved in distribution of funds, but unfortunately, I don't know. Supposedly, Tom Leung resolved the situation with Kang, and he went back to China in 1921 and supposedly visited Kang. He certainly visited some of his disciples. We have pictures and documentation of that, but no information that he actually went to see Kang in Shanghai, where he was living at the time. I know that in 1927, when Kang was celebrating his 70th birthday, he contacted the newspaper people, the Baohenghui newspaper, in San Francisco, which still existed under another name, another party name, but and wanted to, send something over, have a special gift sent to Kang for his 70th birthday, 69th in our numbers. So they apparently made up in some way, but he had disputes with many people, and perhaps for very good cause. Tom Leung was not really a businessman. I mean, he did have his own business, but it was a very complicated and expensive restaurant, and there were many people involved. So it's hard to know exactly. I think it was the pressures, because Kang was so involved in investing in this really expensive, but seemingly extremely promising projects in Mexico. And he turned against the leader of the Mexican businesses too, who he said was in it for his self-interest. Thank you. Yeah.
Are you able to explain the illustration on the membership certificate?
Well, to some extent, I guess. I mean, actually, I'm not sure if this, on the top of the flags, the Baohonghui flag on the left, and on the right is the Qing flag. And, you know, do you know the symbolism, Qirong, of the, or does anyone know the lion and the ball or whatever at the bottom?
It's Chinese characters?
Yeah, well, the Chinese characters, yeah, it's a membership form. But she said the symbolism of the.
Oh, though
of
I don't know
yeah,
the symbolism.
Yeah. I don't know to what extent it might have been something. I imagine other groups had such membership membership certificates too, and it might have been somewhat pre-printed or something. It was pre-printed for sure, and probably in Hong Kong, as I say. So I'm sorry, I can't really explain it very much. The flag has all kinds of symbolism that we've attempted to guess at. We've never seen an explanation in Chinese, but Liang Qichao, it came around the time of Liang Qichao, and I can't remember which are the stripes and which are the stars, but there's meanings for unity. They wanted to have Chinese unified instead of splitting. They wanted equality, I think, and grouping was Huchuan. Grouping, joining together in groups was very important. Independence, both of China and, equality referred also to the equality of Chinese with other nationalities in the United States and China as a nation with other nations. And I can't remember all the others. I never can.
Thank you, Jane.
Yes.
We have another question.
Oh,
Were you finished? Go ahead and
go
finish.
ahead. No, that's okay.
No, I was wondering if there were repercussions for the families back home from the organizers and here in the U.S. and around the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, it was more in a situation. One of the things I didn't discuss at all was in 1900 there was an uprising that was organized by the Baohonghui and Kang, and he raised money for it to overthrow the Empress Dowager and restore the emperor. I mean, there was a military movement. It was organized. They worked with some secret society members in China and so on. There was a lot of money put into it, and fundraising in the United States and other places. And I know in particular there were families of the leaders in San Francisco whose families back in China were harassed, perhaps arrested.
How old was she when she died? I mean, like...
Who?
She was Cixi.
She?
Oh, the
Cixi?
Empress Dowager.
How old was she?
I mean, like,
Well, let's see, what are the dates? I don't remember. I think she was in her 70s. I don't recall, but I'm sorry. Yeah, she was a very powerful woman. I don't know if you've read any of the books about her, but I mean, she was very interested in the West herself. I mean, she became sort of enthralled with certain Western trained students, including one, one of the things that I didn't get into, but Kang, when he was in Portland, met this young woman, Xue Jinqing or Sit Gum Kang, who was the first woman to give a speech in China, and she was very young, at an anti-Russia rally in 1901, I think. And she came over supported by the Baohonghui, and she was one of these women warriors who wanted to assassinate the Empress Dowager. And she her idea was to get an education abroad, go back to China, become friends with the Empress Dowager because she had American friends, and then kill her.
We have outlived the Empress Dowager.
Oh, no, no,
72.
72. Okay, good. You and I, okay. Right, okay.
Thank you. We have another question up front here.
You know, 保皇会 means pro-emperor, right? And they want to keep the emperor system. But the English has Emperor Reform Association.
Yeah.
How it doesn't reconcile?
Well, they wanted, the emperor was a reformer. Guangxu emperor was a reformer. So they wanted to protect him.
Guangxu is a reformer?
Oh, yeah, he was the 100 Days of Reform. He was the one who declared all the edicts. He was in under house arrest. He was most likely poisoned by the Empress Dowager just before she died. She knew she was dying, and he was. Yeah, there's quite a bit of information about that, but we talk about that in the book. But yeah, he carried out the reforms. He knew people like Timothy Richard, this missionary. Was very influenced by Western ideas. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Your book emphasizes Kang Youwei as a feminist promoter in
Yes.
many, many ways.
Yes.
And also cutting off the queue. One of the strong things about his almost revolutionary ideas was that he did not whip up anti-Manchu sentiment.
Right.
He didn't participate in the kind of racism of many
not
of
at
the
all.
lone wolves and
Yeah.
Sun Yat-sen people. So I'm wondering, when did he cut his queue?
I think, was he about 60 maybe? Or I think the picture, what's that? Chirung? What? I know, but it's, yeah, he had, one of the pictures in our book shows him with this sort of
Yeah.
shabby
They used to
haircut.
hide them and have false queues.
Yeah,
Some
my
of the
grandfather
revolutionists
cut
had-
his queue in 1909, actually. He had a wig. I
So
remember
this-
something.
Comes up the whole question of whether or not the queue actually represents submission to the Manchus or to the idea of
Oh.
monarchy.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
It's a
yeah,
very deep
yeah, it is
question.
strange. Yeah, I guess.
Thank you again, Jane, for coming to Portland and spending the morning with us, sharing about your research, the deep research that you've done on this topic. So thank you again, Jane.